Hello, everybody. It's great to have you all here today to join us on our exciting webinar on a topic that's not just timely, but essential in the Pharma 4.0 era. Today, we're diving in the world of environmental monitoring and more specifically, exploring the benefits of going paperless and wireless in this critical field. I'm your host, Clara Sakaris, and I'm thrilled to guide you through this enlightening discussion. So let's get started. On today's agenda, we will first start by defining what do we mean when we say environmental monitoring. Then we will shift our focus from wired to wireless and hear from our first speaker, Brent Lloyd, founder and president of Invisible to Visible Disruptive Technologies and a contamination control specialist. Brent is dedicated to protecting people's health by introducing innovative technologies that mitigate both viable and non-viable contamination. With his extensive expertise of implementing wireless solutions within the life sciences, he'll share insights on how adopting wireless technology can enhance scalability, expedite time to install, and optimize cost effectiveness. Then we will shift our focus from paper to digital with our second speaker, Toon Lambrechts, a self-proclaimed biotech nerd and the co-founder of MyCellHub. Toon's innovative software as a service platform is revolutionizing environmental monitoring by removing the burden of paperwork. He'll discuss how going paperless not only reduces risks, but also ensures compliance and enhances overall efficiency. Afterwards, we will engage in a discussion session to explore the advantages of transitioning to a wireless and paperless environmental monitoring. After hearing from them, you will have the opportunity to ask your burning questions, share your thoughts, and engage with your peers about the exciting prospects of going wireless and paperless. Now, what do we mean when we say environmental monitoring? In life sciences, environmental monitoring refers to the systematic assessment of environmental factors across laboratory, production, quality control, quality assurance, and inventory facilities. Using wireless technologies on the left, Brent specializes in real-time monitoring, focusing on physical factors such as particles, differential pressures, air changes according to specific areas, temperature, and relative humidity. Conversely, Toon, on the right, specializes in routine monitoring, employing a paperless method for assessing microbiological factors such as active and passive air, personal surfaces, for instance, gloves, gowns, hair, personal hygiene, and the overall surfaces of the clean room with surface swabs and touch plates. Going paperless and wireless for environmental monitoring is more than just a trend. It's a crucial step towards a more efficient and effective approach in reducing risk in life sciences. Now let's hear from our first speaker, Brent Lloyd.
Well, thank you, Clara, for the introductions. Again, my name is Brent Lloyd. I am based here in the USA. And today I want to roll through and talk about where the life sciences have been reluctant to adopt new technologies. And more specifically, when I say life sciences, I mean pharma. They've struggled with changing and adopting to new technologies. When change happens, it's a very slow roll, typically for the life sciences, unless they're pushed. And that push usually comes by regulation. My slide here, looking at the telephones here, the rotary phone on the left, and the current cell phone, whether it's an iPhone 14 or the latest version of the Android or the Galaxy, I have the analogy of the life science adoption of the wireless technologies and the cloud platform. They run in parallel. And this is kind of what I liken it to where we're at. And it's hard to think that the cell phones back in the 90s, who would have thought that we'd be carrying a computer in our pocket? Everybody's got pretty much a computer, full access to the internet, can look anything up. We're here now in this world. we're trying to get the life science to move into that vertical too, where this wireless technology is at our fingertips. And that is what part of that is driving this digitization and Pharma 4.0. So I just want to reiterate that the cloud and wireless technology have run in parallel. And Tone and I will explore these hurdles later in the presentation to the adoption of the wireless platform or the wireless technology and the cloud platform. So first, I want to introduce an article that came out of why the life science has increased the cloud uptake and the wireless technology. The title of it is "The Cloud Does Not Bite," and by Agata Mazzara in American Pharmaceutical Review in February 2022 highlights this shift. And people are asking what's triggered this. Lots of times, and you're looking back, COVID has triggered this, and what the business practices that COVID brought into effect. People are finding out they have less staff on site. How do we streamline our processes? Working remotely, we got to make sure people can access the data and from many different locations, because many of us are working at home or have worked at home through COVID or even before COVID. But now it's become more relevant. And really, you're looking at summarization, less IT staff on site, the philosophy of doing more with less. And it's been much easier to outsource to the cloud because there's less IT people on site. One point brought up in this article is that cloud revenue will surpass non-cloud revenue for enterprise IT here in the next 2 years. I find that interesting, the fact of moving over, because you look back 5 to 9 years ago, the cloud was taboo in life science and pharmaceutical. There's been a very quick adoption process coming through that. And some of the things driving that are the scalability of the cloud, the financial savings, and then all the compliance to the regulations. And as we head towards this digitization process, we use the term digitization, and it is something that has been driving force for a lot of these people because it's a risk reduction process also. And then when we focus on what parameters are we monitoring with wireless technology, first of all, look at the environments. The environments can be from any type of clean room to a lab, a controlled environmental space, manufacturing location, storage, fridge, freezers, incubators. Any space can be monitored. But then these parameters, when I know Clara mentioned it earlier, you're looking at particle counts, differential pressure, air exchanges, temperature, relative humidity. And I use the term etc. here because any parameter that has a sensor to it that can have an output of 4 to 20 or Modbus can be monitored, tracked and trended across through the platform. So that's very important. But look at those parameters in the life science vertical, looking at particle counts. Many times those are the particles of 0.5 microns and 5.0 microns are looked at. Differential pressure, monitoring the cascade in inches of water column. Air exchanges is via calculation that takes into effect the volume of air and the air velocity in a duct. And then look at ultra low temp freezers became very relevant in the COVID era, having to track the different vaccines. This is something that environmental wireless technology can track and trend. Any location can be monitored. Just the signal has to be digitized up, and I'll discuss the digitized process in my next slide. When I first started in the EM world about 9 years ago, wireless was not a player in this field at all. And it was due to a couple main reasons, and reliability of the wireless signal, and the systems had not been validated due to them being new. And there was a struggle on how to validate them. And that validation was especially focused on the potential to lose data. Thus, the wireless communication technology has improved the strength of signal, the meshing, the nodes, the hubs, and the chances of losing data have been greatly reduced. In that life science pharmaceutical sector, it's all about risk reduction. And as technology's evolved and gotten much better, so this technology has adopted this, and thus we've been able to validate this technology and fully implement it into this process. On my current slide here, I want to explore a sample topology of a wireless system. In looking at this wireless system, I want to walk through it, and I want to focus on the far right side, there is a temperature humidity probe here on the far right side. That sensor typically looks like a sensor plugged into the wall or ceiling, coming in, connected back to a meter. This meter actually takes and digitizes that signal, typically 4 to 20. That 4 to 20 signal goes back in, it gets digitized into the meter. That meter then talks up to a hub or an access point that's centrally located, or you can have multiple locations throughout your facility. And this is communicated via Wi-Fi, via low-ray, via Bluetooth, via Zigbee, whatever communication protocol people want to use or their platform is can communicate with, they take it up to there. Now, what's interesting is it goes to the access point, and then what's nice is, and what's become really important in the past couple of years is redundancy, because you can send this up via plugging into the Ethernet and going up via the internet. You can actually have a cell phone modem and send it up to the cloud that way. And then the data can then be, once it goes to the cloud, it then can be back down to be visualized by the people having to look at the data to analyze it and acknowledge alarms and reset the parameters within that system. Or that data can also be exported for a controlling mechanism to the building automation system, which is very relevant as these building automation systems want to be able to communicate. So I just want to refresh how important this whole process has become, and especially on the offering the different redundancies has become very important, and then the communication with the building automation systems. And it's interesting with everybody always wants to ask what makes pharma move to the wireless cloud-based solutions. And there's three to four main points depending how you want to look at it. My focus here is looking at scalability. The cloud is limitless at this point. At least most people claim it's limitless. We can keep adding the farms to the data, the cloud storage systems. Wireless systems are easy to install. You don't have all the infrastructure. And elaborate on that a little bit more. Right now, when you put a wired system in, you have a control cabinet that has to be cable, tubing, and pulled. You have to meet all these codes to install it. Typically, wireless systems are 60 to 80% less time to install on site. With less time on site means you actually have back in production much sooner, which makes it better for the facility for less downtime. So there is a great ROI on that. The another point is access. It's at our fingertips. We mentioned earlier about having our cell phones in the computer. You can access it from anywhere. Now, the other thing we'll talk about is how to protect that data and what happens with all these different authentication, two-step authentication, and the different programs to keep data safe so you don't get hacked and you don't lose your data. And that's very important, and that's something that's always going to be at the top of the mind. And then this links, that access links to the cybersecurity part of it, which Tone and I will explore later. So, Clara, I hand this back over to you for Tone to take over and go from there then, okay?
Yeah, thank you for that, Brent. That was very interesting and very comprehensive about going from wired to wireless. So next up is Tone, who will delve into his first-hand experience in helping biotechs adopt digital solutions.
Thanks, Clara. It's a pleasure to talk about this because I will take over where Brent left off, basically where we have the fixed and the real-time systems. I will focus more on the routine environmental monitoring systems. And it's one of those processes that I believe that does not often get a lot of attention, so I'm really happy to talk about it. And actually, it's a quite challenging process. If you look at the slide, there's an example of how it happens today. There is often an operator or multiple operators even that follow a certain route through the facility, and they sample very predetermined locations that are indicated on their paper in the facility. And this operator has this paper record with him, and on that paper he actually sees, for example, every line you see there on the paper is a sample point that he has to take. And every point he samples with a specific technology, he's writing down manually, for example, on the lid of the sample plate, as you see on the left in the slide, he's writing down there manually where the sample was taken, when it was taken, and what were the sample parameters, for example. And so then all these plates, all these samples from all the different rooms across the whole facility are collected in one batch, and then they are incubated, for example, and analyzed a couple of days later for all the bacteria and mold or yeasts that are growing on them. And then all those results are again centralized in one, often a big Excel file by the QA team, to trend the results and basically make sure that the environment in which we're manufacturing for drug manufacturing or whatever, that the environment is in control. And so it's important maybe also to note that these operators, they sample multiple rooms a day, and every room typically has multiple dozens of sample points. So there's easily hundreds of these sample plates that they need to label first, then analyze, and then trend the results. So it's the scale of that routine environmental monitoring that is very big, in combination then with, let's say, all the manual work that is needed to do all that labeling and so on. And this introduces a lot of potential points of failure, I think we should call them. For example, there's quite some paperwork logistics needed to get the right sampling records at the right place to sample the right people during the right activity. That's one challenge. All the sample data is noted down manually. And well, let's face it, mistakes happen when you write something down. We've seen actually in practice that once the number 1 in a manual writing easily becomes a 7. So readability is sometimes an issue. But also the QA team struggles sometimes just to go through this whole pile of paper to check for completeness and accuracy. It's easy to miss an error. All the papers look the same. It's very, I mean, the errors don't really stand out. We've also seen already that papers get lost or damaged by, I don't know, maybe a coffee mug that is spilled. And of course, I mean, all this manual copying of data from the labels to the Excel files and so on, it makes the trend analysis a very tedious job, and also typos and copy mistakes happen there. So all these errors are very easy to make, and it's quite clear that this is a very challenging process. So in my next slide, we thought, okay, can we reimagine this process by taking into account some of the digital tools that Pharma 4.0 offers us, and how would this process likely to change? What would we like to change? So one of the first things, personally, I think, is automate every boring task. I mean, our cleanroom operators, they have better things to do than copying data from a paper to an Excel file, for example. This automation also leads to cost reductions, and automation also leads to risk reductions, because everything that is automated can be validated, the scripts can be validated, and so less mistakes will be made. And instead of spending, let's say, active energy and brain capacity, I would say, to keep all the things compliant, it would be nice if the platforms that we use or the systems that we use kind of take care of that automatically. So I'm thinking now of review by exception mechanisms, or at least automated flagging of data that is out of specifications, or maybe a signature that is missing. It's nice if the system would proactively warn us of stuff like this happening. And then, of course, I think Brent also mentioned it already, that you don't want your data to be too spread out. I mean, everyone needs access to that data. So you don't want it to be in multiple documents on multiple people's desks. It would be nice if it's centrally located. And so that's actually what this Pharma 4.0 can bring us. And that's also the technology that we applied in MyCellHub's environmental monitoring module. If you look at the next slide, you see some screenshots of our module. And basically what we do is, for this routine environmental monitoring, we provide operators in the clean room or whatever in the controlled environment with a tablet. And on this tablet, they get the right sample plans that are presented to them at the right time for the right activity. And then, based on that predetermined sample plan, we guide the operators through the facility. For example, with the small mini-map that you see on the screenshot, we can indicate exactly where they need to take a specific sample, how they need to perform the sampling activity, and so on. And of course, instead of manually labeling all the samples and the lids of the samples and so on, we can use the camera of the tablet and the built-in barcode scanner to link all the settle plates or sample plates with the locations that they were sampled at, and also the results that come later. So let's say the traceability is built in from who is doing what, when, with which materials, by making use of barcode scanning instead of making use of copying data from one material to another. And of course, many of these, like active air samplers, for example, or like the handheld particle counters, not the ones Brent was talking about, we can use IoT tools to get the data directly from those sampling devices, so that even less manual data copying is needed. And so those are all improvements, I would say, that help or enable the operator in the clean room to perform their job faster, but more importantly maybe is that it will help them to be more accurate or make less mistakes in executing this tedious process. And so that's from the operator side. If we look at it in the next slide from the production manager side or the QA team, they of course depend on having accurate environmental monitoring data to do their job. So another very important part is this visibility of the data. So for them, we make sure that all the data is easily accessible from one central location, like Brent mentioned also. And basically that means that on our platform, as soon as a sample is scheduled, you can follow up in real time when the sample was actively taken, what the result is of that sample. The platform automatically interprets if the sample result is within specifications for that specific location, for example. And since all the data is digital and central, it's also much easier to follow up, let's say, in real time, the current status of your facility or your controlled environment. And that brings us to the reports, because we see quite often that in clean rooms, even where you would expect that everything is nicely maintained and documented, that the trending reports for a specific clean room is often only done every 3 months, every quarter. But with a digital system, you could in theory do that every day. I mean, it's just one click of a button. And with that click of a button, you get a trend line, for example, with all the latest information. And so this obviously allows you to detect possible sources of contamination, or maybe even in the future predict, I don't know, some sources of contamination much earlier than you would have been able if you were working on paper. So that's a massive advantage. And I mean, I think if you look at just the improved quality of the data, the simplifying of the compliance, and in general, also what Brent already mentioned, the risk reduction that comes from adopting these novel technologies, in this case, this digital tool, for me, that personally could already be a reason on its own, for anyone who's currently working on paper to maybe just at least consider making the switch to digital. But then in the next slide, we made a use case with a current customer, and what we often hear is that the cost of implementing such a system is too high. But also there, I would argue that with the current lightweight software, just like a phone or television is also not that expensive anymore as a couple of decades ago, there's more lightweight software, pre-configured SaaS solutions, for example, like ours, but there's others. And I think those arguments for cost over time, and especially if you take into account, let's say, the hidden cost of working with paper, they will become irrelevant. I mean, if you look at just the cost savings for one medium-sized site for one of our customers, the cost savings were estimated to be around 150,000 euros per year. And so the investment of the implementation of such a digital system is only a fraction of that. So again, as with the wireless implementations, also here, the implementation is not that difficult. So it results in a very interesting return on investment if you look at these cost savings. And I propose I end my presentation here. I hope that both Brent and I at least made you rethink a little bit your current systems and get out of the status quo, and happy to discuss how we can move forward and get rid of cables and papers in controlled environments.
Thanks a lot, Toon, for that. We will now be starting our discussion section. And we just heard from Toon about how going paperless can reduce costs. Brent, would you mind sharing and elaborating on how embracing wireless technologies can lead to cost reductions as well?
The cost savings is huge because when you have a wireless system and a cloud on the cloud implemented, what it does is it does digitize and track and trends, and it has the capacity to do all that in one place. When you have an audit going on in your facility, whether it's the FDA or the EU is coming in and they're inspecting you, and you wouldn't have your documentation in place, or you wouldn't have that all the I's dotted and T's crossed, you can get cited. And that citation is a lot of time and money to resolve those, because you require a lot of paperwork in-house to take care of that and go from there. And that's one of the huge things that I see when these systems become digitized and take that off the plate. The biggest ROI that I see is it helps keep you compliant. And we've talked about the compliant perspective, but above and beyond, when you have a citation because you're not compliant, what that can do for the people within, especially in the quality group, it is astronomical, the hours that you can spend tracing that back and sending the documentation over and making sure you're all good to go and moving that forward. That's what I see happening a lot. Toon, what do you see on your side from that perspective?
Yeah, from our side, I think we see a similar sign. To be honest, the cost always is brought up in terms of the cost of doing a change, for example. What I think is, we have a blog about it, and I think it's always interesting to look at the hidden costs of doing stuff on paper. People are kind of in the mindset that paper is free, but it's not. Like, you have to make sure that it's properly stored. The scanning of the documents is way more expensive than you think. And so if you offset the hidden costs of paper with investments in this type of novel technologies, I think quite easily they are at a status quo. And then if you look at all the additional advantages of, all the stuff we discussed, less risks, better data, stuff like this, it's almost a no-brainer. So financials, of course, super important, it's always a hurdle, but with the right use cases and case studies, often, often you can come to some reasonable agreement on that, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Toon and Brent, for discussing the cost reduction in adopting a paperless and wireless approach. I'm interested to hear, we heard about the benefits, but what are the main hurdles in going digital? And can you give us some practical steps on how to smoothly shift to paperless environmental monitoring and wireless?
Yeah, Claire, I can start this, and Toon and I'll work together on these. Looking at some of the hurdles to the acceptance of wireless technologies and the cloud platforms, listing them off here is company culture. That'll be a big one we'll discuss. Lost data potential, the regulations, always changing but slowly, the security of the cloud, and then the financial investment are some of the main hurdles to acceptance. Toon, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, 100% agree. And like you said, we discussed this before. I think those are the main ones. The financials we discussed, maybe something that I always think is an interesting one is the security. Because just like with the hidden costs of paper, I also think there's hidden security risks with paper. People always are afraid of being hacked and all my data is lost or whatever, but with the proper backup procedures, with the proper encryption procedures, this is all kind of taken care of if you are working with a known, let's say, service provider, I think. But again, like with the hidden cost of paper, often we see people, they don't take into account, okay, what if my basement where all my paper is stored floods, or what about fire, or what about just even more simple things, like what about the coffee mug spilling over all my papers? So the security of the cloud also there, I think it's a very interesting topic, but let's move on. Let's accept the cloud. It's the way forward. There are risks, but we have to and we have to deal with them properly. properly, don't get me wrong. But there's also risks with paper, so it's just how you have to deal with those.
Yes, and I agree completely. One of the hurdles is the company culture, which I think this is a large struggle. And it's funny. I actually have a famous quote by Albert Einstein: "Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results" is one of my favorite quotes that I tell my kids, and they get frustrated when I say it to them all the time. But I think that is very relevant here. Is they've done it this way for years. It's validated because remember these processes are all validated in pharma, but yet now we got to change, and that's hard for some of these people. And it's actually a company culture internally, and it's not unique to pharma, but this culture is very ingrained. They change, but change is very slowly. Nothing happens fast, and does people get frustrated with regulation? But the problem is no change happens unless there's regulation to enforce it. And people say best practices, yes, but if those best practices aren't memorialized in some type of regulation, it's very hard to implement them. And that's what I see happening with that company culture perspective. And that's where I see it's you got to really go in and address that with the front side of it. What are you looking to do? And pharma is driven by the reduction of risk in that company culture. That has to be at the forefront of it. And like it or not, like we talked about in the beginning with the cell phones, having cell phones going back to the rotary phones back in the day, we don't that was in the past. We don't want to go backwards. We got to go forward. And I think that's what getting people to understand and acknowledge that we can do better. And I think the end point of this is too that these are medicines. The pharmaceutical industry is producing medicines that save people's lives and help make the world safer. And I think we got to remember that we can do better. And this is part of the doing better process.
Yeah, if I can add to that, it's like a typical change management process. Often what we see is that there's maybe one internal champion that is pushing for the change, but he has not talked with all stakeholders, and then he's blocked from everywhere because people are not ready to make the change. And that is really something in the company culture that is, yeah, it's something you have to address when implementing this. Put everyone's nose in the same direction.
Yeah, agreed.
And
another one of those hurdles is the regulations and changing slowly, as we've talked about.
yeah,
There's always these alphabet soups, I'll call them, from the regulatory bodies. When you look at the FDA, the EMEA, the GMP, the 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, and you can go on and on with all the different regulations, the different verticals. And I think a great example of how slowly regulation is changing is the biofluorescence technology that's brought into the Annex 1 right now is being discussed, where you can actually use biofluorescent particle counters to look at viability, comparing viable organisms in real time in a particle counter to our traditional plate methods. And it's been slow to be adopted. They've looked at it. They're looking at new innovations and bringing it on. It's been around for 15 plus years and come out of the DoD side of things, and we still haven't got it fully implemented into the pharma world. They're working towards it, but it's not here. It's taken a long time to bring that in as an example of how slowly new technologies are adopted into this world.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, coming back also to the previous point, the regulation is also just making it quite hard to change things in the company. So it's kind of baked in the DNA of pharma with all the regulation. But on the other hand, what I do see, for example, recently is, when you implement a new digital system, the computer system validation, it's very tedious, it's annoying. Okay, you can have templates and so on, but still you have to go through it. At least recently, we do see the shift, for example, to computer system assurance, where you can have a bit more of a risk-based approach. So also there, I mean, yes, regulation is very slow, crazy slow, but it has to be safe, of course. We're talking about drugs, and everyone wants safe drugs. So probably they have to be slow, but I think there's, it's moving in the right direction at some parts at least.
Yeah, and I think that's so relevant. And then the other part that I see driving this is that financial investment. It's a large financial investment, and I think Tone, you referenced the 150 plus euros that it saves for you guys. And I guess what does that translate to in like full-time employees? Have you guys done that correlation yet to that side of things?
Obviously, depends in which country you're working. In Belgium, where we are based, mainly very high wages. But typically, actually, for that example, there were two people almost full-time working on, doing all the routing for the routine sampling, the labeling, and the trending. So let's say it's more or less two full-time people that can help. I mean, there's also quite some shortage on the labor market with all these trained people, so they can do more interesting jobs than just running around with sample plates. It's not just reducing the jobs; it's giving the trained operators a more useful job in the time that they spent in the clean room, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the other component is the investment component of it, because when you put these new systems, there's a large financial component on the front side of it. So the installation, the physical components going in is a large part of it, but then it's the execution, the IQ, the installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification. And after that's done, you have to get all your initial employees trained, and then as you onboard new employees, as those new employees ebb and flow in and out, we've got to get those trained and stuff, and the ongoing training and for system updates. It's ongoing, and I think that's something always to keep in the back of your mind. But we've got to keep learning and doing better is what it boils down to. But there is that financial component to what people are always scared of. But I think it's been very well defined now as we move forward into this new digitized era, and companies are embellishing this. And what can we do better, and how do we do this better? How do we streamline our process? How do we get that ROI? I think is a driving force for this.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, that risk reduction that we keep going back to.
Yeah, there is a bit of tension in the field about all the financial, and there's seemingly less money last month. So I think this return on investment exercise is critical when implementing this, and it's a fair assessment you have to make. But okay, I think we're getting there on the financials. There is enough information on that.
Yeah. And I go back and I'm always thinking, like, what's next? Where does this go? Where does this take us to is what I'm always thinking about. And there's many things out there. I know artificial intelligence, looking at analyzing large data sets that we can't, as humans, we can't analyze and interpret, where AI can take and crunch those numbers down. Real-time identification of pathogens via different technologies, whether it's MALDI-TOF or biofluorescence or what comes next. It's probably not even invented yet. I know biosensors are a big thing out there right now where they're looking at real-time identification. But what is next? What's the next evolution look like for the cloud and the wireless technology? It's exciting to see what's next.
Yeah, I love thinking about this. To be honest, it's we're a software company, and we deal with massive amounts of data, all these sample points. So for us, everything that goes into the AI, machine learning realm is super interesting to look at. But I have the feeling we first need to learn how to walk before we learn how to run, type of mentality. So I think the first thing to do let's implement what we have, like tools like we presented today. But then the next thing is to make these two talks together, for example, that all that information is even more centrally available. And, the environmental monitoring is so related to, for example, the cleaning processes. If you could use the environmental monitoring to update, the frequency of your cleaning to make that more efficient and stuff like this, or maybe reverse, I think that's the next level of efficiencies that we will get. And we don't even need artificial intelligence for that. We just need data and some logical thinking for that. And of course, as more data is collected, I think artificial intelligence will be used maybe to predict contaminations before they even happen, stuff like this, based on certain patterns. I really believe that is not too far in the future. How that is validated, as we discussed before, that's maybe another question with the slow regulation. how to deal with AI in GMP environments. I think that's a whole other topic for a webinar. But for sure, it's coming our way, this artificial intelligence, for sure.
Now, I'm wondering, we're talking about wireless and paperless. If somebody is wanting to digitalize, where should they start? With the wireless or the paperless?
Interesting question. It depends on, what is your pain point? If you have a QA team where the paper is piling up on their desk and they don't know where to start with paper. But if you are, maybe like Brent was saying, if you get this warning letter that your freezer is not in proper control, start with the wireless. I mean, it really depends on the use case, I guess.
The chicken or the egg, which comes first? I guess which is their biggest pain point, and which is easier for them to take on initially. I mean, it really varies. And you go into one client, you've seen one client, and it could be the exact opposite with your next client you go see. So it really varies. And it just goes back to how the company culture and what their thought processes are. And everybody's different.
In terms of data management, we're creating a lot of data going wireless and paperless. How do you manage so much data? How do you show what's actually important data and what's not so important?
Oof, that's a tough question. In a way, I think it depends on what profile is looking at the data. I think the nice thing about a software is it's we're looking all at the same data, but the QA person can maybe configure his view in a different way than the operator, because the QA needs different data points or different accents than the operator. As long as we work on the same data set, which is hosted in the cloud, which is completely scalable, I think there's ultimate flexibility when going digital.
Yeah, and one thing I think is how that data is visualized on dashboards, and that's always changing as you collect more data, it gets more granular, and then you might see trends and that you didn't see initially as you collect more of that data over time, and that becomes a very relevant perspective. And it seems like data overload, but we're collecting data. And I referenced earlier that in the particle counts, microns of 0.5 and 5 microns. Many of these particle counters collect many other data channels. Like a lot of times the pharma world won't even collect anything else but the 0.5 and 5.0 because that's what they're worried about from a regulatory perspective. And they just don't want that to become an issue with too much data overload on that side. So they don't even collect that data.
Okay, that's interesting. I have a question, and it kind of goes back to your company name, Brent, Invis to Viz. What's a common misconception about digital environmental monitoring you'd like to address in terms of going from invisible to visible?
Well, I always in the past here, I've been seeing all these new technologies come across in front of me. And how do you take them from one industry to another? The pharma industry is not typically an innovator in that side of things. They bring new medicines, but bringing technologies to facilitate that process is not something they do on that side typically, but they develop these medicines and how to bring them to market. But how to produce them and how to work on this side, it comes from other industries. I work in other industries, including semiconductor, aerospace and defense, believe it or not, in the food world. You think the food world is very similar. They are more proactive in different arenas than the pharmaceutical vertical. So it really makes it unique on how they look at those things. And I think bringing that across into that pharma vertical and spreading it from one vertical to another is where it gets exciting to get the technologies across, where it's already proven one place in one vertical and bring it into a new vertical. And that's what I work with in a lot of my situations, because I see a big bandwidth of different verticals across my clientele.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that, Toon and Brent. Now let's move on to the Q&A session where our listeners will be able to, give their feedback and ask some questions to you. Hi, everybody. We're back for the Q&A. I just wanted to remind you that to write your questions in the questions tab, and we will try our best to answer all your questions. Our first question is from Fatash, and they are asking, how do you mitigate cybersecurity risks considering the new FDA rules that have been introduced, and how do we make sure we stay compliant?
Who should take this question?
Yeah,
Brent, go ahead.
Great question. And I'll go first on this. Everybody wants to talk about the cybersecurity of the cloud, and over the past 5 years, the security has increased tremendously. When you look at the big cloud servers, Google, Microsoft has their own stuff, AWS, whatever cloud system you're on, many of them had to go through the DoD side of things for their clearance, for the capacity to prove that they meet certain cybersecurity protocols. That there's tons of those cybersecurity protocols out there, and cybersecurity exists whether the server's in the cloud or on your local server in your basement or wherever it's at in your facility. So those same situations exist. And need to be constantly monitored. The one thing I see and hear about all the time is the lack of IT support at your facility has been greatly decreased, especially over the times of COVID. And for that, maintenance has been a big concern. The cloud is up 24/7, and these server farms are huge in that application. But that's how I see it, how the cloud has definitely handles that for us 24/7 and what they're doing, but constantly has to be monitored no matter whether you're local or in the cloud. What do you think, Tone?
I don't know the regulation Faktash is referring to be honest. I think I quickly scrolled through it. It's the medical device world, so it's a bit less in my domain, but I think, covering your basics makes a lot of sense. Make sure you have proper access controls, rotate passwords. That is the type of stuff you have, if you do that already properly, you get a long way. And then many platforms like MyCellHub, but many others as well, we make sure that every data is encrypted, both in transit when communicating over Wi-Fi, but also when it's stored on the server. So that is another very important point. And what I think is also very powerful is that platforms like ours, we only allow devices that are registered beforehand by an administrator on the platform with the right permissions and so on, and the right device numbers and so on, that only those tablets, computers, devices are allowed to make changes to data on the platform. So also there we have proper control of who's changing what. But it's like we mentioned in the talk, it's something to actively take care of, and it evolves so often. So it's active control you need to do there.
Okay, great. We have another great question from Rihanna, and they are asking, what advice would you give to a startup on how we can implement wireless at an early stage? I'm presuming this is for Brent.
Yeah, well, honestly, if I'm a startup going down this path, I'm going to start small, but the nice thing about wireless is the scalability and the ease of implementation of it compared to the wired system. And when you start small, maybe you pick whatever you're monitoring, whatever process in the R&D side of things, or you're in full production. It depends where you're at on that side of it. But pick your biggest pain points initially, make it a small system, get comfortable with the software, get your staff up and going, and then in your next shutdown, implement other things and staged processes. But instead of throwing it all at everybody at once, it's kind of nice to get initially started in a small system, launch it, get it going, work out the internal processes, and have it feather back to your own internal SOPs is how I see it being the easiest.
Okay, great. Thank you for the advice. Now, another question that we have is from Aaron, and it asks, how do you help analysts cope with moving to a paperless system when they are losing the ability to verify missed entries from their paperwork? More specifically for associates that have done paperwork all their life. Tone, towards you.
That's a very specific question. In the case of MyCellHub, we have a customer success team, and they help you basically to translate your paper-based system to a digital system. There is a validation process that is needed for that as well. I mean, we're working in GMP, and they're one of the main things to check is data integrity, stuff like the missing entries is yeah, it's a pain on paper. It's difficult to spot. While moving to digital, that's kind of solved automatically. But maybe I need a bit more information on why entries are missed on the paperwork. But typically, we cover this in a proper validation with some tests to make sure that everything is configured properly.
Okay, great. We also have another question asked by Toby towards Tone, but Brent, you understand trends and data as well. So the question is, could you please outline how the MyCellHub platform visualizes and trends data? Is there integrated functionality that enables automated flagging of OOS and or concerning data trending?
Yeah, so this trending, especially in environmental monitoring, is so tedious. There's so much data, like I mentioned in the beginning, and basically the platform that we provide visualizations of the trend lines per specific sample point for every specific room, for every type of sample, sample like active air samples, passive air samples, stuff like this, for every different type of sample. It's basically an automated trend line that you get. And we compare every individual sample point to the right specifications. So depending on the activity in the clean room, and obviously the grade of the clean room, or the grade of the location where the sample is taken, the specifications are linked to that automatically. And then once the sample results are back, the colony forming units are back from, I don't know, maybe your analytics lab or your internal lab. They are compared to the specifications, and we have indeed active warnings when you go over the alert or the alarm limits, and then it's up to you to figure out what happened.
Okay, great. Now a question for Brent. Do you believe there's a balance to be struck between embracing new wireless technologies and maintaining more traditional methodologies? Where do you see this balance?
I think that balance probably lays within their company culture, and we've talked about that company culture earlier in our presentation. And the wireless technologies can help fill some of their, or help some of their pain points. They're having a pain point somewhere. They're not in compliant with something. They're missing documentation, or whatever it is. Those pain points are what's going to drive that. And we've said it earlier about the regulation. The regulation will drive their pain points for them. And that's when it becomes painful enough, or their system is outdated and they've got to make, it's an end of life, and they've got to make a decision are they going to go back to the traditional wired system? Are they going to move on to the wireless system, and where it goes from there? But I really think it boils back to the culture of the company. And are they forward thinking? Or are they kind of, hey, we're going to set tight one more cycle on this instrument, on this equipment and software, and go from there? It really varies per that company culture. I think it's very important, but it can be found. It's just where does the company point it in what direction?
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I just saw there was a follow-up question for Tone about the algorithms. Tone, are there integrated algorithms that support trend analysis to pick up on upcoming OOS before they happen?
That's an interesting topic. I did a PhD research on time series analysis. So yes, there are quite some. Basically, what most people use is this IMR chart or this control chart. Basically, the trend line, every time point has a trend line, and then the standard deviations. That's very easy to use, and it provides quite some insights if you use them well. I do believe that there's more advanced technologies, like I mentioned, like time series analysis, for example. You do need some data for that. So I would say start simple with the classical approach. And once we collect more data, like we mentioned, we can go to more advanced data analytics. And I do really believe that, like I mentioned before, by analyzing the right patterns, you might be able to predict a bit faster or with a shorter time horizon where an out of specification might show up. Yeah, I'm really convinced that this could be done.
Okay, great. One of our final questions, we have 2 remaining. This is for both of you. What type of stakeholder have you noticed to be the driver of implementing wireless and paperless technologies, digital technologies?
I would say every level in the organization is affected, or at least has to be involved as well in implementing something like this. But if you're asking for the main drivers, at least for MyCellHub, I often see the manufacturing team that is struggling, let's say, to get the paperwork done in the clean room, or on the other side, the QA team that sees all the paper piling up on their desk. So it's either manufacturing that wants to reduce their workload in the clean room, or QA who's basically overflown.
And would you agree with this, Brent?
Yeah, it's lots of times I see the quality as the driver for that, especially going from the wired to the wireless systems. It's quality as driving, or facilities typically.
Okay, great. And Toon, another follow-up from the previous question, and they are asking if the functionalities you discuss exist within the MyCellHub platform.
Today they don't, but Toby, let's meet after the webinar to see how we can implement that together. I would love to work on that.
And our final question for both Brent and Toon: what are the main change management tools you both use to convince your customers to go paperless and wireless?
To convince customers?
Well, customers, I guess, or stakeholders to go wireless.
One of the things we mentioned a lot in the presentation is this ROI, return on investment exercise, let's call it. It's convincing future customers. I think that's important. If we talk about customers, like to get them on board in the digitalization process, once it's decided that we implement a digital tool, I think, again, I come back to this customer success team that we use to really help them on board with the new technology, train them, make sure they're comfortable with the system that is configured as specifically how they would like. And then what we often see is that project management is not so easy on this type of thing. So proper project management tools that people can kind of look a bit in the future, what will happen and when effort needs to be spent over time. I think that's also going to be nice tools to make sure that everything is running smoothly when implementing something like this.
Yeah, and I agree. I just think the other thing we talked about just a little in an earlier question was the pain points. You got to find the customer's pain points and help them with their pain points, address that. And then when you go to that cloud and wireless processes, it's the accessibility. And then with the companies, you got to do the training, and it's you're there initially for the training, but there's ongoing training, and they hire new employees. There's an ebb and flow for those employees, but always touching and being accessible to help train their current employees on new portions of the software that's released, or updates, or help them solve their problems to implement new things for their company. So I think it's just being accessible to them to help them through their process. It's a journey.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brent and Toon, for your time today. I'd like to also thank all our listeners that have joined in, and I hope that you have gained some valuable insights, and this webinar has given you some tools in following through with your digitalization journey. Feel free to reach out to either Toon, Brent, or myself via LinkedIn or our emails, which will be displayed after. Or even on our websites to just have a one-on-one conversation. And I'd like to particularly thank all our listeners in the US. So have a great day there. And for our listeners in Europe and the UK, have a great evening. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Bye, guys.